We're currently only a few days away from Razi's release, so it's time to do a quick recap on where the meta is right now. Before we get started, I do want to clarify that this will be a solo mode only tier list. The data points that I'm mostly focusing on will be pulled from solo queue, both in the higher ranks on the NA ladder, as well as the qualifiers that we just had last weekend, where we got to see 6 different groups of the highest level of competition in NA and EU, all competing against each other over on the ERCS held on my Twitch channel. If you want to see a highlight of the qualifiers and see some of the hype action that happened last weekend, we have a highlight video up on my YouTube page. Also, guys, the finals are going to be this weekend on January 16th, so keep your eyes out for that if you want more high-end solo action. So to get right into things, I want to talk about one of the builds that has been one of the more popular builds in the last couple of days. This has been a build that sort of exploded onto the scene after being relatively unpopular for a while, but due to some buffs to the character, due to some changes of the skills, it makes her a lot better, and it makes this particular weapon a lot better for this character. And of course, I am talking about Rapier Fiora, which is very clearly an A+ character. Also, in addition, I will be placing Spear Fiora in A, and Two-Handed Sword Fiora in B. The reason being is that Rapier Fiora has just sort of excelled between these 3 builds so far, and we've yet to see too much coming out of Two-Handed Fiora in the recent days. Now, that's not to say that Two-Handed Fiora or Spear Fiora can't compete with Rapier Fiora, but currently Rapier is just sort of clearly the frontrunner when it comes to Fiora builds. Next up on this list is actually going to be one of the most interesting characters on this list, in addition to one of the lowest ratings on this list, which is going to be Glove Hyun at A tier and Tonfa Hyun at D tier. Now, Hyunwoo is not a bad character, and Glove Hyun isn't bad either. The only issue is that Hyun, as he is right now, is not one of the best solo fighters in the game. He's more of a utility character that also can scale really hard in the late game through the use of glove skill, which is one of the best weapon skills in the game. Now, of course, the issue with that is that if you take out the glove skill from the character, aka if you play Tonfa Hyun, you just sort of have a lackluster character. He doesn't excel in basically anything. So Tonfa Hyun, he is going to be in D tier. He's going to be the lowest rated character on this tier list. Now, this next rating might come as a bit of a surprise to you. This is a character that has been dominating this tier list for the last couple of tier lists. It has been consistently in S tier, but due to a string of nerfs in the last few patches, we do have to push this character a little bit further down. And of course, I'm talking about Xiukai. Xiukai with both Spear and Dagger. Now, despite the fact that I am putting Xiukai with both Spear and Dagger in A+ tier, it sort of remains to be seen if he ends up dropping further below this or not. His ult has seen some significant damage nerfs to it, dropping from, I think it was like roughly 50 per wave down to 20 over 2 nerfs. Of course, that's only at rank 1. It does end up scaling very well into the late game. It does still apply flat amp for each wave, so it is still a very good skill, and Xiukai has a very good kit behind him as well, but that does absolutely bump him down, at least from S tier down to A+ tier. He could be even further down than that too. He could drop to A tier if he doesn't end up showing up in these next few days. Next up on the tier list is another character who has both of their weapons in A+ tier, and of course, I'm talking about Isol. Despite the fact that AR Isol and Pistol Isol are both very different in their playstyle, with AR Isol being more of a snowbally build focusing on crit, and Pistol Isol being more evasive, focusing on that chaining with his Q, being able to Q, reset Q multiple times in a chase, also being able to just run away far better than AR Isol. Either way, both of these builds are absolutely insane, and they both land him at A+ tier since he's just one of the best characters at surviving to the late game, but still being able to close out the game. It's important to keep in mind when evaluating characters in solo that being able to survive and being able to get away from fights that you don't want to be in, choosing the fights that you're in at all times, is one of the most important characteristics of any character on this list. And since they buffed the range on Isol's dash, and since he is just slippery in general because that stealth does come out instantly, Isol is definitely one of the best characters at the moment for solo queue, for getting that high placement, but also being able to win the game. Now, next on this list is actually going to be Yuki. It's going to be wherever Yuki ends up falling, and I think it may not come as a surprise to just about anyone that Two-Handed Sword Yuki is in A+ tier. It is one of the best characters in the game. Now, this might be a surprise though. Dual Sword Yuki has actually managed to land an A tier because they keep buffing it and better builds have been coming out for this character archetype. Dual Swords Yuki has actually been buffed a lot over the last few patches, and it is finally at that point where it is seeing relevancy and the point where it can actually be played at high tiers to much success. Now, to give you a taste of what one of the S tier characters in this game is, I'm going to be placing a character that we all know is S tier. We all know they're one of the best characters in the game, if not the best character in the game, and of course I'm talking about Chiara. Now, Chiara is both durable, mobile, and just overloaded with good skills on every single one of her abilities. Her ultimate is essentially 2 skills in one, and it's one of the most powerful skills in the entire game. As long as it's available, she is a powerhouse and almost impossible to actually kill, and it lets her trade very efficiently because she gains that extra invulnerability, and it gives her that big true damage bonus right at the end of her combo. Also, her spammable long-range root that lasts for a second and a half, one of the best CCs in the game. It makes her a formidable opponent, and of course, that means that Chiara will be landing at S tier on this list. Now let's talk about one of my favorite characters in the game, if not my favorite character in the game right now, and of course, I'm talking about Sissela. Sissela is a ton of fun, but also she's very controversial. She is widely considered one of the strongest characters of all. The players who play her often say that she has a lot of flaws and a lot of counterplay to her. So where do I end up putting Sissela on this list? Now, this may not actually come as much of a surprise to you, but in my opinion, Throw Sissela is actually A+ tier. It's one of the strongest characters in the game, it has a lot of strong points, it's mostly held back by the fact that its routing for most of its good weapons are pretty bad. Crit Throw Sissela has been seeing a lot of popularity over in Korea. It hasn't been played as much in NA, but it is still such a strong and solid build overall. And as for amp variants that use Ruthenium Marble builds on Sissela are actually extremely powerful if you can actually finish them. But that's the issue, is that Ruthenium is one of the worst weapons to path at the moment, and it's very difficult to pull off a Ruthenium build, but if you do manage to finish it, it is actually extremely powerful. Now, as for Shuriken Sissela, yes, Shuriken Sissela is not as strong as Throw Sissela, but it does still have Caltrops, which is one of the best weapon skills to actually have on Sissela. So as a result, I will be placing her in A tier. If there are ever some quality of life buffs to shurikens, either the stats become better or potentially the throw, like charge count, becomes better on them, because right now some of the best shurikens are limited by very low charge counts, or if potentially the mastery or the range, something about shuriken gets buffed, it could bump up to A+ tier very easily. It's very close, but it's not quite there yet. Now, let's talk about Shoichi. Shoichi, similarly to Sissela, also struggles with very poor routing. His best weapon is a 3-zone weapon, but that doesn't mean he has any shortage of strengths, so as a result, I'll be putting Shoichi in A tier. He has the potential to be absolutely insane in the right hands. Also, if you manage to get your build off, he can snowball into one of the most powerful characters in the game. His only issue is just getting there at this moment. If potentially they make his routing easier, if potentially lighters become more readily available and easier to find or less contested, then yes, we're going to see Shoichi become probably A+ tier, maybe one of the best characters in the game, because he does have the ability to snowball if he can actually finish his build fast. Next up on this list is a character that I personally love. I have a lot of history with this character, and I do think they're quite powerful. And of course, I am talking about Aya. AR Aya to me is a solid A+ tier, Pistol Aya is a solid A tier, and Sniper Aya, it's pretty much in B tier at the moment. So I'm going to go through each of these individually and describe why they are actually where they are. In my opinion, AR Aya is the best version of Aya at the moment. It's strong, it's solid, it's consistent. If you can finish the weapon and get your first core items finished, it is a powerhouse that is impossible to kill early. And honestly, it scales very well into the end game too, because AR skill is absolutely insane at ensuring that you win every prolonged fight. Additionally, Aya's passive is very good at making AR skill durable. It's a very tanky build. Its only issue right now in solo is that it is relatively low on mobility, which is one of the most important stats for a solo queue character. Now, speaking of mobility, that's why actually Pistol Aya is in A tier. Pistol gives a character a ton of mobility. It gives them the option to move skill, reset, and then move skill again. That's a ton of mobility. That's a ton of movement speed, dashing through walls, whatever you want out of it. It makes your character very mobile. The problem is that Pistol Aya in general just sort of lacks the inevitability that AR Aya currently has. Now, as for Sniper Aya is one of the harder to evaluate character/weapon combinations on this list because they've been buffing it a lot lately, but it's not entirely obvious how good it's going to be in solo queue at the moment. We've been seeing more Sniper Ayas in general, and I think it does absolutely have the potential to be in A or A+ tier, but I don't think Sniper Aya players have necessarily figured out how to consistently close out games to be a win. They can very consistently make it to the mid game, get a few kills along the way, but actually winning it has been a bit of a challenge because it is so low on mobility. So that basically just remains to be seen if these most recent buffs to Sniper Aya are able to make her in an A or A+ tier in the near future. Now, to not be quite so redundant on pistols, I'm going to talk about the one remaining pistol character in the game, which is of course Silvia. Silvia is an A+ character for many reasons, but her mobility is probably the most important of all of them. Silvia has one of the best escapes in the game. She has the best chase in the game as well. So when it comes to solo queue, when you know that mobility is so important, a character like Silvia does do so well. Silvia also does synergize very well with that pistol skill, giving her the option of doing full bike combos, getting off her bike, knocking people back, slowing them, healing herself, resetting, and doing it all again very fast. Silvia is very strong early game. Well, after she finishes her weapon, she's very strong in the mid-late game as well. She only sort of struggles with scaling into the absolute end game against auto attackers like Jackie and Fiora, other characters like that. That being said, again, Silvia is quite good, and Silvia is definitely a solid A+ tier on this list. Now let's talk about Adriana. Adriana has received a lot of changes over time. These changes have sort of been understated, and the players who main Adriana have slowly but surely shown that Adriana is better than people give her credit for, especially given her very troubled past of being a relatively low tier character. Currently, I would actually place Adriana in A tier. Honestly, with the right pilot, with the right build, and honestly in most situations in general, Adriana's pretty good. She actually outputs a ton of damage, and she has a lot of mobility and utility to her name. Definitely do not sleep on Adriana. She is actually quite powerful, and you'll probably be seeing more of her in general going forward. Now, this next character is a character you don't see very often, but trust me when I say I feel very confident about this placement of this character. I think she's good in the right hands, and I think her builds are okay too. Of course, I'm talking about Hart in A tier. Hart is honestly one of the perfect examples of just a solid character at the moment. They have good damage, they have a variety of builds, and thus a variety of build paths. This character is just good overall. They have decent mobility and good chase as well, which are both good characteristics for a solo queue character. I am comfortable saying that Hart is just an A tier character at the moment. Now, one of the most underused characters in NA is actually going to be Magnus. Magnus doesn't get a lot of love in NA. There's a few hardcore dedicated Magnus players, but he is far more popular in Korea than he is here in the States. So it makes it a little bit harder to evaluate him because you just don't see that many Magnuses. But in my opinion, I do feel pretty confident about putting Hammer Magnus in A tier. I also think that Bat Magnus is pretty solidly in B tier, but honestly it could be A tier in the right hands. So it actually makes it a little bit harder to evaluate him because you just don't see that many Magnuses in NA, but trust me, I feel confident about Hammer Magnus being in A tier and Bat Magnus being roughly in B tier. I think you'll be seeing more amp tanky Magnuses coming forward. I think he has good mobility with his ultimate, at least for getting away. Overall, he's just a solid pick. Just be aware though that his lack of mobility outside of his ultimate does make him a bit of a flawed pick for solo queue, but overall, he's still pretty decent. Next up is one of the most popular characters in the game, and also someone who sees a ton of play in NA, and is honestly one of the more controversial characters at the moment too, because of their insane mobility. So the fact that I mentioned mobility should actually sort of spoil which character this is going to be. Of course, I'm talking about Jackie, the poster girl of the game. Now, This is where things get spicy because there's 4 different versions of Jackie, and I think you'll be surprised by where I place them. Two-hand sword has just sort of fallen behind in the meta. The other versions of Jackie have found better builds that sort of adapt to the current meta better than dual swords. So overall, it is just B tier. It's okay, it's on Jackie, it's got great mobility, but it's not as great as it once was. Now, Axe Jackie has actually been seeing a lot of play recently in Korea, and it's been seeing a lot of nerfs on its weapons too because it was actually so dominant and so powerful. That being said, with the nerfs, I am comfortable placing Axe Jackie in A tier. And just above Axe Jackie is actually going to be Dagger Jackie, coming in at A+ tier. Dagger Jackie is very consistent, it's very strong early game, and it scales well late game. If you transition into Frag Rack, it also just can output a lot of burst damage that people aren't really ready for. Also, guys, since mobility is so important, having access to another escape tool or another engage tool makes Dagger Jackie quite good right now. And to cap everything off, I'm placing Two-Hand Sword Jackie in S tier. Two-Hand Sword Jackie is just one of the best builds and characters in the game at the moment. The fact that you take a character that already has great mobility and you give them one of the best defensive tools in the game in the form of two-handed sword skills parry, it makes it one of the best character/weapon combinations by far in the game. It's very strong, it's very mobile, it's nearly impossible to punish, it chooses every fight that it wants to be in, it's just very good at the moment. Now, as we wind down this list, it's time to talk about Nadine. Nadine's actually been seeing a lot of waves recently amongst higher tier NA players. If you're very, very good about marking your camp's timings, if you're really efficient in your farming, and opting to stay in a similar area throughout the entire game rather than spreading out to the entire map and just taking an area and farming it consistently with timers, yeah, Nadine's actually quite good, and honestly, the fact that her build comes together as soon as you essentially just finish her weapon makes her one of the most consistent characters in the game. Good Nadines can essentially assemble their entire build just off of stuff they get off of animals that they farm, so that makes her very early game focused, but then able to safely transition into the end game simply by having a very, very high farm count. So anyways, her rating, Crossbow Nadine is A+ tier, and honestly, Bow Nadine is A tier. Now, next on this list is going to be a character that came out recently. Of course, I'm talking about Emma. Emma is one of my favorite characters to ever release because she's actually just a ton of fun. But here's the issue, Emma has flaws. She has mana issues, she sorta has damage issues, and her kit is just sort of lacking, well, it's lacking a lot of things that you really want out of a solo queue character. That being said, she does have decent mobility. She just has to sort of choose between being able to cast her spells a lot to give her good mobility or damage. And honestly, her SP costs are definitely dragging her down too, as you do have to itemize for that as well. As a result, I have to place Emma in B tier. She's not terrible, she has flaws, but she can be good in the right hands, and some of her builds, when pulled off, can be pretty decent as well. Next up on this list is going to be one of the most consistently powerful characters in the game. Of course, I'm talking about Dailin. So first, let's talk about Nunchuck. Nunchuck is one of the hardest versions of Dailin to evaluate at the moment. Nunchuck Dailin has actually been buffed a lot over time because the amp scaling has gone up quite a bit. Now, the problem is we don't really know where Nunchuck Dailin is going to sort of end up being at the end of the day because, well, we just don't have a lot of time on the newest buffs for Dailin. We don't know for sure where she's going to land, but honestly, my money's bet is that she's going to be around B to A tier, so for now, conservatively, I'll be placing her in B tier. As for the more historically powerful version of Dailin, Glove Dailin, I honestly think she's been dethroned. I don't think she's quite S tier anymore because she has received a couple of nerfs over time, which have honestly just brought her down below S tier. I think Glove Dailin at this point, it's pretty safe to say she is around A+ tier. Glove Dailin does still have the ability to pop off with an insane amount of damage, either through crit versions or through amp versions. I do think Glove Dailin has a lot of potential still, and I do think we'll see her still be around that A+ tier. Now, let's talk more about Zahir. Zahir is one of the most consistent and safest characters in the game. They can honestly miss half their skill shots, but as long as they land a Q or two, that gives them enough mobility to get away from pretty much any engagement. It also gives them the ability to chase down pretty much anybody because they can just chain movement speed slows on enemies and speed ups on themselves. Now, one of the biggest issues with Zahir is actually the fact that it is hard for him to finish his routing on any of his throw builds, which are potentially his most powerful builds. That is, of course, Ruthenium Marble being just a pain to actually finish. But with that being said, I do have to say that Throw Zahir is solidly A+ tier, and I do think that Shuriken Zahir is roughly A tier. Zahir has the potential to be very powerful, very mobile, and very safe, but again, similar to most other casters in this game, they do struggle a little bit with routing and making sure they actually get all the resources that they need, because AMP resources are very contested at the moment. And as one of the final picks on this list, let's talk about Lenox. She actually just came out. She is a lot of fun, but she just received some massive nerfs in this latest patch. So where does that leave Lenox? Honestly, it's hard to say because the nerfs were so recent, so it's still a little bit difficult to determine where she should go, but personally, I think I'll be placing her in B tier. The nerfs mostly just made it so that her fights will take longer, but her lack of mobility is still a big disadvantage, especially in solo queue, which is of course what this tier list is only talking about. Yeah, she can eventually win a long drawn-out fight, but she still has big issues with dealing with third parties, and she also just honestly has trouble making sure she actually secures a kill, seeing as she can't chase as well as others can run away. That being said, guys, she did just get a bunch of nerfs, so we'll see if she ends up dropping even further below B tier, or if she ends up actually being okay and moving up to A tier. In any case, I think it's pretty safe to call her in B tier at the moment. Now let's talk about the last character, the only character we haven't mentioned yet so far, which of course is Hyejin. Hyejin is simultaneously one of the strongest and weakest characters in the game. They've been buffing Shuriken a bunch lately, but it remains to be seen if that is actually enough to still make that version of Hyejin viable. That being said, Bow Hyejin is one of the most powerful weapon character combinations in the entire game. It has so much mobility, it has some of the best CC and kiting potential in the game, in addition to really good chase, and of course, it has some of the highest burst and highest prolonged damage in a fight ever in this game. So, of course, with that being said, I have to firmly place Bow Hyejin in S tier. She is an absolute powerhouse and one of the strongest characters in the entire game. Now, as for Shuriken Hyejin, honestly, I'm tentatively placing her in C tier. She is still just not that great and does leave something to be desired, but that being said, I think this archetype is a little under-researched at the moment since it did just get buffed again. It's at 10% additional damage dealt and 10% less damage taken, so we'll see if that's enough to elevate her up to B tier, or honestly even beyond that as well. There is some rat builds that do kind of ensure that you always gain LP by being alive until the final 3, but it basically can't close out games at all. It honestly just kind of is anti-synergistic, with Shuriken skill just not being that useful on Hyejin, and Shuriken stats just being weak in general with bad mastery, and of course bad stats on the weapons themselves. But honestly, I cannot emphasize this enough. Bow Hyejin is one of the most powerful character slash weapon combinations in the entire game right now. It's strong early game, it's strong mid game, and it snowballs really hard to be very strong late game. It's safe, it's powerful, it's an absolute beast. And that's it for Bow and Shuriken Hyejin. And that just about covers it for the entire tier list. Guys, what did you think of my takes? What did you think of my placements? Do you disagree? Do you have some potential characters that you think are a little bit slept on right now that you'd want to see the player base evaluate further? In any case, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more intense, high-ranking solo action, there will be a finals for the ERCS Solo Open this weekend on January 16th, so keep your eyes out for that. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.